Hey, everybody. We're here back with the interview series, and I'm thrilled and delighted to present the one and only James Newton, composer, flutist, intellectual educator, a really, really inspiring force of music in our current musical landscape. I've had the pleasure of working with James on a solo trumpet piece for his latest album, The Manual of Light. The trumpet piece is called The Voice of One Crying in the Wilderness. And I'll post a link to that as both the score available for purchase from James's website and the album. It's really, really an awesome piece, and that led to James and I collaborating a bit more, and the album ended up coming out on my label Orenda Records. But James has been, a complete force in music for decades, and I feel really thrilled to be able to share some of his perspective with all of you. So, without further ado, I'd love to, introduce James and have him give us a little bit of background and history about his own life in music and perspective, and then we'll open it up and see where the conversation goes. So, James, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with you, Dan. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss a number of things that we're going to traverse today. And one of the things that, when I think about my background, my parents, of course, like most of us, have had a gigantic impact upon us. And the music that I heard when I was a child, um, my father loved Duke Ellington, so that stayed with me my whole life.
Mhm.
And one of the things I think about a lot is Duke Ellington painted in sound. He was a visual artist. Uh, he saw music in colors, almost like Messiaen and synesthesia on a certain level. And and I believe that there are many things that we can take from other artistic disciplines and put into, whether it's the sound of the trumpet or something that you're writing. And that resonance of what we've learned through, let's say, the medium of visual art can have a gigantic impact upon the way the colors coming out of whichever ensemble or solo instrument it is. So Duke Ellington, you you're connected with Africa right away.
Mhm.
The polyrhythmic nature of his music, also the microtonality, and the fact that as abducted Africans were brought to the country that we live in, um, many things were going on because you had all of these different countries and culture groups that were brought together, and they were all giving this stamp of being less than human. They spoke different languages, and oftentimes they were separated so that the people of the same culture group would not be together so they could communicate. So they had to create this survivalist approach to life. And I think one of the things that it was brought was a hyper development of culture because you have so many different sources all
Mhm.
coming together. And then you're taking things from what exists here. I think what Duke Ellington did, and Jelly Roll Morton sort of set the model for it. And Ellington came along and compositionally took the things that the great improvisers were performing. And Louis Armstrong's being the grand assimilator, always say the solo in West End blues is like the big bang of jazz. That moment where things explode and the rhythmical vocabulary defines the human condition.
Mhm.
And so my father gave me that. And and that stayed with me. And as I learned other musics coming from other cultures, I could see this concept flourishing. You know, one example might be when I was a kid, the None Such recordings came about to Explore series, and remember hearing Japanese gamelan for the first time and finding it difficult to breathe because it was so astonishingly beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
so lyrical. And those fiddle recordings took you to where they were. Okay. I know it seems like I'm going off on a tangent, but I'm going
No,
to
this
try
is
to connect.
great. Like the best thing that we can get from our guests are your stories, you know. So
Yeah,
please share
yeah.
away.
Okay. And he loved the blues, more urban blues. And so that also stayed with me. This way of taking color and tone and bending it. In other words, there's other things in this in the sound. You know, the voice will come in the trumpet, and you know, all of a sudden you have a desire to put a plunger in the end of the trumpet, so you can really get this vocal effect.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about that kind of communication, and where you have a desire to make sound experimental in the true sense of the word. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like you, of course, you have your straight tone as trumpeters, and your airstream is your soul. Your diaphragm is another addition that really tells us who you are as an individual. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and so how can we? The blues gave the vehicle to so many people to express themselves in ways that they could tell the world, hey, this is who I am. This is what I believe in. And you can make your individual stamp, and individuality is so important in the musics that I was raised on. My mother basically only played sacred music. So she played, I heard Mahalia Jackson, Sam Cooke when he was with the Soul Stirrers, a lot of that music, and occasionally some popular music, but not too much. My father was more the secular person in the family. My mother was really geared towards the sacred. And I think those combinations really helped me well. And it wasn't until, and I started with electric bass, and I played in rhythm and blues groups. I sang the high falsetto parts. Jimi Hendrix came along, and I heard "Are You Experienced" in a record store in San Pedro, California, and my life changed. I could hear the blues. I
Mm-hmm.
said, "Oh, okay." And but the sonic vocabulary was so arresting, and I think from that moment on, this concept of experimentation with sound and bringing noise into the vocabulary, and really keying in even more on nature, because Hendrix was um, such an exceptional musician as a composer. The way he layered his guitar tracks one on top of the other after the other really impacted my compositional approach. But so all of these things are kind of swirling. But when it came to my mother, she was deeply religious. So we went to church at black churches when we were here. And then when we would go to Europe, it was more kind of a Protestant church that might be on the army base, something in that area. Um, now, what did I get from spirituals and gospel music? I think what I got is an understanding of the power of communication.
Mm-hmm.
my first experiences with going outside of my body occurred in the church because my mother was from Eastern Arkansas, rural county, Lee County, Arkansas. And the first memory I have is four women singing in the church, no piano. And I was getting all these chills down my spine. And I could see people, what we call falling out in church, where their spirit takes over and they're gone. And so a few years later, when I heard John Coltrane, I could feel the same thing, you know. And he's taking the rhythm of the Psalms and a love supreme. And then when you look at the later music, which is so rich and profound, and it hasn't been studied enough. And I use a lot of that compositionally, you know. Expression is one of the great records on the planet. And he was sort of like coming full circle. And the other thing about Train, people always used to say, he sounds like a preacher, you know. He had that ability to lift the audience. The great drummer Billy Hart once told me he came into a club, he was playing in, I think, Philly, and he rushed back so he could hear Coltrane's last set with the great quartet. And the music was so intense that there were a number of people that were standing up. And everybody, he said the majority of the people in the club were screaming. They just, it got so intense. Now that's the stuff that really interests me. You know, when you're going to a place where you're in a state where the impossible becomes possible.
Yeah.
My mother took me to those areas. A lot of times the music, sometimes the scripture would be given to me. And when I say from above, as to what I would set, and there's other times where I said, I've got this orchestra commission, which text should I use? And she says, oh, the 91st Psalm, you need to set that. So we had that kind of beautiful dialogue, and Amazing Grace was her favorite song. And so that's the reason, and President Obama, you know, it's just like all of these things that collide together and you have to move a certain way. What else would I say? I spent a lot of time abroad because my father was in the service. So I got exposed to going to an El Greco exhibition in Munich when I was 9 years old. And I lived in Stuttgart and Ulm. And one of the tragic things that happened to me when I was young is that the two things that really stick out in my youth was seeing an image of Emmett Till's distorted face after he was killed. And we lived in Dachau for a year and a half, and death lingered in the air like a cloud in 1962. And that experience struck me. And I went to the camps. My parents didn't want me to go because they didn't think I could handle it emotionally, but I had a few German boys that were friends that we would bike a lot, and they took me. And so when we got back to the States, it's like all these images of people getting beaten up, and you just see how low humanity can sink.
Yeah.
We're dealing with this now. And my mother, she gave me a way to cope with it because she brought me to the Lord. She told me the understanding, the power of faith, you know, and just the fact that our faith is Judeo-Christian, and we, both my parents taught me to be very open to other cultures, be respectful of them, and come into them with humility. I think in academia, one of the huge failures that continues to exist is scholars coming into other cultures with arrogance and too many preconceptions,
Yeah.
rather than coming humble, come lowly. Say, I'm here to learn. I'm here to be respectful to you. I treasure who you are. I treasure what you do, and the world needs to know more about what you do.
Yeah.
You know, and so those are some aspects of my childhood. I didn't start playing flute until I was 16,
Hmm.
but I was playing electric bass when I was 12 in rhythm and blues groups. And then when I started playing the flute, I didn't begin to read music until I was 18. And I'm grateful for that pathway because it made me really develop my ears. We were taking pieces that our band wanted to play off, just by ear. And so when I started learning to read, I developed it very quickly because had been memorizing rhythms, and I could look on the score and say, okay, that's what it looks like. But I was drawn into studying classical music from hearing Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun,
Oh yeah.
and that just really grabbed me.
Yeah.
And also Samuel Barber, Adagio for Strings. Those were two pieces, but very quickly after that, I was deeply into Eric Dolphy, even though I could barely play. And I was reading his influences, so I was checking out all of the jazz musicians were inspired by. Many of them I had knew their work, some I didn't. But Mingus was like a vehicle to the whole history of jazz.
Yeah.
And then Schoenberg was one of the people that Dolphy mentioned that was a great influence for him. So I, I didn't know Beethoven's string quartets, but I went straight to Schoenberg, and I
Yeah.
learned his, within my ears and within my heart first. And then I sort of worked my way back, and then I worked my way forward to listen to a lot of contemporary music. Olivier Messiaen, I heard Quartet for the End of Time when I was 19, and that and Toru Takemitsu's Green just opened up these new vistas, and I became obsessed with those two composers. There were things in their music that touched me in new ways.
Yeah. Man, there's so much in there that would be great to get into. One of the things you kind of touching on just in the last minute there, is just this wide range of influences from all different kinds of styles of music and backgrounds and nationalities and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things that I'm really deeply interested in currently is the sort of blurring, if not complete disintegration of genre lines. I really have no interest in trying to categorize music, regardless of whatever the sort of necessities of selling music might be. But I think from an early age, it sounds like you're kind of in the same way bringing in your love of Hendrix with your love of Ellington and Messiaen and Schoenberg and Eric Dolphy and all these people. And I think one of the things that is unfortunate about academia is the separation of schools. So you could be a jazz major or a classical major and never have any cross collaboration with the other department. And I think it's really important for students to kind of let that distinction go and really see what they can get inspired by from any angle. And I know on the platform here we've got a few people who are maybe just starting to improvise or just starting to compose, and I'd be curious, what would your recommendations for somebody just getting into those waters be as like as an educator yourself?
Okay, I completely agree with you. The silos are choking academic environments. Um, and even more equally dangerous with that is you have to call out the fact that these are bastions of white supremacy.
Sure.
And opera is almost continually at the very top. I love opera. I'm not against it, but I think the budgets have to reflect a new way of thinking.
Yes.
So if there's greater distribution of the money, maybe you do fewer operas, okay? And maybe the symphony doesn't quite get all of the money that it should, but I was liberated when I heard November Steps by Takemitsu,
Mm.
because I didn't know a shakuhachi could do those things. I had heard traditional shakuhachi music, and I carefully studied some of the great players like Watazumi Do, and I listened so carefully to his airstream, and I tried to imitate that, you know. And it made me think about the flute in a completely different way, and I knew that there were all of these possibilities out there. And I needed to explore those more, but I had to do most of that kind of work on my own,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so, what I would say to the women and the men that are listening is look to other cultures all the way around the world. Take vacations from what you know. I think, and delve into the unknown. And as we were talking before we started recording, you know, we have to spend our time in the etudes, and
Mm-hmm.
we have to continue the scales, and we have to continue the long tones. All of that is essential and important. I'm not saying leave that. What I'm saying is maybe you can expand even within that context, sort of what's done. Look for composers that are not so well done. I'm going to put a name out there. Um, Martone, and his last name is spelled Ille's. An unbelievable Hungarian composer. And I'm really going to try to do my best to get back to your point, but I've just got to mention this, and I'm trying to gather my thoughts together. In the 60s, the predecessors of myself and all of my colleagues, they were really into sound experimentation. If you go back and you look within improvised music in what's called the jazz world, in the 20s, there was all this timbral experimentation, and it kind of quieted down a little bit in the next decades. In the 60s, it came back again. And there were all these recordings that went away from straight tempo, and you know, you had all these multiphonics and other techniques that were being used to get to something that was happening in society during that period, you know. And so the 70s, when I came and I moved to New York at a very young age, I think I was 23, 24, and I started playing the flute when I was 16. So that was crazy, you know. But we kept that sound experimentation going, and we explored it very deeply, but we kept connecting it to emotion,
Mm-hmm.
to what we believed in. It wasn't detached from our body, it was connected to our body. And so I try to push myself to learn of different composers and different improvisers that are not so well known, so I can keep being introduced to new thought. And Marton Elish, you see the connection to Bartok. You see the connection to Ligeti. You see the connection, how all of that is there. And he's using some of that, some of that sound experimentation, which we think of this period in real contemporary music, let's say, within completely notated context. But sometimes I feel the emotion, I'm struggling to connect with the emotion of some of the composers that do that. Maybe it's something that I'm missing and I'm just not connecting with. But Elish, when I listen to his music, my breath is taken away. Mm. So players, composers, go to new sources and look back at the same time. I'm preparing to give a lecture for the Hillsburg Jazz Festival on the music of Charles Mingus, and going back, I've just been smiling these last few weeks because I'm going back to my young days of listening, and Mingus even brought me closer to Ellington. But there was Charles Mingus, the experimentalist, who was culture flipping, mm-hmm. But he was also things that he did on the bass, the just phenomenal technique he had on the instrument. Some of that came from other cultures, Yeah. And so, so I would just travel. You can travel by technology. I think that's the thing that this time has. Any place in the world, you can just about be there in a tick. Mm-hmm. And you have access to what's happening politically, what the big cultural movements are. You can even learn about obscure artists there, and whether they're in visual art or literature, what are they thinking? What are they doing? I think knowing where I came from, but also this whole thing about looking out. We can look. One point of reference I can give them is in the end of the 19th century, 20th century, France was captivated by Japanese woodcuts. Debussy used to collect them. You hear them in La Mer. Mm-hmm. They're there, the images. And now we can go to the Hubble telescope site and we can see images in far away from us in other parts of the universe. Form is there.
Yeah.
God created it. The form is there. Mm. So that's what I'm trying to look at. That's what I'm trying to be inspired by. Images of plumes of gas being thrown with all of these colors and shapes, and that's form. Yeah. That's musical structure also. It's like I lived in museums to study composition. Mm-hmm. I learned just as much there as studying the great composers. Yeah. Regardless of genre, because it didn't mean much to me, like it doesn't mean much at all to you.
Right.
We're both coming from the same point, Mm-hmm. And that goes all the way back to the way that my mother and father taught me to be open, come humble, come lowly,
yeah,
and learn.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is really salient, very clearly in your personality, but also in your musical output, is a lot of your work is in the sacred space, and some of it is in the secular space as well. For those who don't know James's full history, I'll put your bio in the link or in the comments here. But you've been widely recognized as one of the vanguard, of quote jazz, but also, very well received in the quote unquote classical world as well,
Mhm.
as a composer and performer. And one of the things that I think is really great, and for me personally, inspiring about working with you, especially in the context that we have, is that in your pursuit of sacred music and as a composer, um, it doesn't shut off secular people from that experience as well. So, in my case, I'm non-religious, but I do have a really deep interest in the intersection between intelligence and intellect and spirituality, whatever that means for a person. And I feel like for me, when I'm performing or writing, sort of the greatest moments find that sort of marks the spot of that intersection
Yes.
of the intellectual and the spiritual. And it seems like that pursuit is really central to your music as well. And I wonder if you might riff on those kinds of ideas for a second.
Wow, that's a big question. I love
I know.
it. um, when you're open, I played with, as a flutist, I played with people that uh, didn't have a particular belief. Um, I played with people of a number of faiths, and and I played with people of so many different cultures. It's up to the individual, and but our responsibility is to respect one another. You were raised to respect other people. I know
Mhm.
that, because I know from hence where you came,
Right.
and that is for me the most important, one of the most important things about collaboration with people. You have to spend some time shutting up and listening, you know. So, as a musician that had all of these amazing experience with master musicians on the stage improvising, one of the things that I've been sort of obsessed with is moving that also into a fully notated environment and figuring out ways to notate what we share on that stage. And you understand those two worlds. So you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Hmm.
Um, and for, let's say, the people that are just beginning to improvise and do not have a lot of experience, I'll give you just one concept. Billie Holiday was a genius on so many different levels, but she's seen as a great vocal artist. But she was a genius. Louis Armstrong had this concept of playing ahead of the beat, way ahead of the beat, slightly ahead, on the beat, slightly behind, way behind. What does that do? Each place on the beat gives you a different emotional terrain. Just think about that for a second. It's profound. Not
Absolutely.
because I said it, but because these great artists created it. Because this is something Billy heard Louis Armstrong doing. Who got it from Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey? I think they're the sort of the first people in the line that set this up. And Louis Armstrong worked with Bessie Smith. He worked with Ma Rainey. And so this is a concept that started with women. Um, this is something I share with my students all the time. So these different places in the beat Billie Holiday found out that she could bring an audience into her world in such a profound way that they understood that they could cope with the challenges of life a little bit better, because she was saying, what you felt, I've gone through. And this is how I feel about what we share. Dang. Okay. So when I compose music, and this, whether it's pulsed or not pulsed, this is what I'm thinking about. A quintuplet is slightly ahead of the beat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you might think of, you know, West Africa, you've got two rhythms going on all the time. Even if only one person is playing it, they're thinking about another rhythm and the dialogue that's occurring between those rhythms. Septuplets are slightly behind the beat, but I use a lot of biblical numerology. So the 7 also represents the number of God. Sextuplets I hear as being on the beat. They're triplets, you know, two triplets together on the beat. And where you put the accents within the quintuplets, the sextuplets, and the septuplets, it's a whole other thing. And so we can go up to the larger tuplet configurations, but if they have an emotional direction to how they're used and how they're coupled with other rhythms, that gives me, I can pull a little bit of some of the things that we feel when we're improvising into the notated context.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the thing about on the score, sometimes you really have to tell, give the performer a general landscape of what you might be thinking about and let them interpret how they feel about it. So everything is like the composer, the performer.
Right.
You know, it's like you've got to find this space where the people have the freedom to breathe somewhat within the music, you know, so they can internalize it and give there's something from themselves. So we're learning from the performer and the composer.
Yeah.
That's very important to me. I've when I was a flutist, I worked with some composers that were so, it was almost militaristic.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have to be that way, even if you're hyper specific about the music that's on the page, but you have to realize you're nothing without the performer.
Right.
You know, so it's get rid of the hierarchy there. You know, that's one of the things I've thought about a lot, you know. And so anyway, this whole thing about different places on the beat and specificity about emotional terrain is a big deal. I want to bring that. That's one of the junctures where when this thing comes together and you've got that, then it can begin to take you into another realm.
Yeah.
And
It,
then that opens up so many possibilities of what can happen. There's so much of that late train stuff I'm trying to get in these pieces also, you know.
mm-hmm.
And I think I can, you know, I for different works I had to travel to different places, you know, before one note was written,
Yeah.
you know, so it's just like that.
Mm. Speaking about the rhythm and the placement of the beat, I was sort of chuckling to myself because it reminds me of when you see like somebody's written out perfectly transcription of a solo, you know, and there's all sorts of complex rhythms in there that I can almost guarantee were not consciously thought of in the moment. You know, they were just
Right,
feelings, you
right,
know, and that's a really beautiful point about how feeling translates into rhythm, you know. So like, um, there's lots of times where if I'm soloing, I'm pushing or pulling the way that the notes interface with the beat, and it's not necessarily that I'm shifting from septuplets to quintuplets or not. It's just it's interplay, it's dialogue, and
Right,
and
right.
and that's what makes it feel so alive, or one of the things that makes it feel so alive. Um, and I think it's a really interesting pursuit to try to figure out how to bring that into a notated context while maintaining that feeling.
Yes,
Like
yes.
when we were working on the trumpet piece, um, you know, there were times where you were asking me to play it more like Freddie Hubbard, even though
Right.
what's on the page would be like challenging for Håkon Hardenberger.
Right.
So it's really beautiful, and I think what that shows, and one of the things I kind of use as a sort of simple way of describing that breakdown of genre and influence is like if you think about like your iPod or your iPhone and your iTunes list or whatever. And if you just hit shuffle on, I don't know about you, but on my phone you'd pan through just thousands of different kinds of music, so to speak, right?
Same
So
here. Same here. Yeah.
all of that swimming up there in your head as some sort of stew, and when you write or when you play, you're not separating it. It just
Exactly.
kind of comes out however it comes out, And I mean, a lot of times, people will say, "Oh, well, did you consciously try to combine this and this?" And it's like, "Well, no, I just listened to them." So one of the things I've been talking about lately with students is the idea of deep listening, and the idea of like also deep listening without a visual component. Like nowadays, because of YouTube and because of Instagram and places like that, you can see people performing music, as easily as traveling anywhere in the world, right? But I think that watching a concert is different than listening to a recording, and it accesses different parts of your brain and different parts of your emotions. And I know that when we went to your house to listen to your record, I know you take listening very, very seriously, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it means to really listen to a recording or a piece of music, and how that can inspire one's, practice and pursuit.
Oh, I love that question. Pauline Oliveris, deep listening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay. I received a lesson. Maybe I was in my early 40s. I'd have to think about it. Yeah, that sounds late 30s. Takemitsu came to town two times when I was in town. One was Peter Serkin premiered, oh God, what was the name of that piece? It's slipping my mind right now, but it was with the LA Phil. And I told my son, I said, we're skipping school today. You're going to go see one of the greatest composers in the 20th century. You're going to listen to his music. He said, okay, Daddy. So we went Waterways, I think it's called. I'm not sure, but maybe that seems to be bubbling up. And I intently watched Takemitsu listening to his work. What a lesson. And then I had an experience where I was teaching at UC Irvine, and I took one of my students who was studying Takemitsu's solo flute works. The Hollywood Film Society, they were honoring Takemitsu for his film work, and they played some of his chamber music. Again, I watched Takemitsu listen. He closed his eyes. The level of concentration, the complete immersement inside the sound world. So, okay. So there it is. You know, there's times where we play things, and occasionally there might be some conversation here and there, but the deep listening is crucial. And what does that mean? A part of what it means for me is that sometimes you're going outside of your body, or you're going so far inside your body. It could be one or the other, but you definitely got to go step outside of your normal world. Sometimes I'm thinking you couldn't be in the bell of a trumpet, obviously. You'd end up both deaf and crazy.
Yeah.
But it's almost like trumpet players can relate to this, I believe. How the sound changes is, let's say you're teaching a student, and sometimes when you're right in front of them, maybe 4 or 5 feet away, and they're playing, or when you get up close to them and you're moving to sides, different sides, the sound is going to change as you're moving. And it's going to change quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think also when I'm listening at home, there's a certain place where I'm going to sit with the system. I paid a lot of attention to the sound system because listening is so crucial for my development, not only as a musician, as a composer, but as a human being. And sound is healing. Sometimes there's certain pieces I have to go to when I've been through it. And they're going to take away things inside of me that don't need to be there in part, because I'm listening for multiple things. I'm listening to be healed when I go to those pieces. I'm listening intellectually. I'm listening as a person that understands the way that sound hits the body is incredibly important. And where it hits the body is another thing, And that has a lot to do with the choices of tessitura that I write for certain instruments, how, let's say, the instruments that are, whether it's a drum set or timpani or wood blocks or temple blocks, all of those things hit the body in a certain way. The sordo drum hits the body in a certain way, So all of that is in the equation. But I tell you, I marvel at how people, the great composers and the great improvisers, the human mind. I'm going to finish that question, but I've got to take a walkabout first. And that is, those composers and improvisers and performers, the really deep ones, the heavy ones, know people get color and emotion being connected. That's something they've been taught a lot. But timbre and emotion are so unbelievably connected. And that's one of the things that I really focus on a lot. It's one of the reasons why I love certain composers so much. Late Ditier, I love because of the richness of the orchestration, and it's like this ability to extend that French tradition, that great French tradition of orchestration to remarkable plays, pieces like, and I've got all the scores over there, let's see, Correspondance and The Shadows of Time. Those pieces really grabbed me. And Martin Les's music. And I can go on and on with a lot of improvisers and composers that we know that, do both. But I need to be taken to new places because I need to grow.
Mm-hmm.
So the listening, it's like stop the world. I want to get off, I want to slow time down.
Yeah.
I want to get lost in the sound. And sometimes I need to be really intellectually involved. And there's other times to where I need to be less intellectually involved so I can be emotionally tossed about,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah.
Every time you come to listening, and then sometimes you just come because you're drawn to a particular performance, a particular recording, or a particular piece, or a particular video,
Mm-hmm.
It's like, my God, how much did I learn from the DVDs of Claudio Botto conducting the Mahler Symphony Cycle, except for number 8.
Mm.
And when you look at that master and the way he's shaping each phrase with the left hand and what he deems to be the most significant that he helps the orchestra with, how what Mahler was writing is in his eyes. It's on his face.
Mm.
All of the different ways that the hand is working to tell the story. The way he shapes the phrases with a long movement of the arm.
Yeah.
And then as a composer, you got to reverse it. And you look at your piece. Am I giving the conductor? Am I giving the orchestra what they need
Mm-hmm.
to exist in the piece? Even though the density might change often, and whatever way you're approaching it, what are you giving them?
Yeah.
So the listening is just so essential. I sometimes I spend hours listening in one day, and sometimes I don't have the time. I have to wait till I can really slow down. I'm very careful about what I listen to.
Mm.
Very careful about what I consume. And I listen to secular music. I listen to sacred music. Sometimes when I'm in a sacred space, like I'm just about to finish Psalm 119. Maybe in 2 months it will be done. It's been a 3-year journey.
Wow.
And there's times where there's certain things I can't listen to, So I think we also have to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Give me just a quick second.
Sure thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm cognizant of your time here, and you've given us so much. I'd love to maybe just feel a couple of more questions if that's
Sure.
okay with you.
I want you to get what you need.
Awesome. One thing that I heard you say in another interview that I think is a really cool, little addendum to what you just said was that sometimes the piece teaches you as you're writing it rather than you teaching the piece. And I think that's, to me, one of the things that's been most interesting as a composer is how different the compositions become from the initial inspiration.
Yeah.
And they take on a life of their own that you can't plan for.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you have any more thoughts on that idea.
Let's discuss you for a minute.
Okay.
when you're in that space and you've begun with a set of ideas, let me ask you this. Every time you go there, is it a different experience, or sometimes are there things that repeat themselves?
Well, I think there's certainly uh, language, either rhythmic or intervallic, or that comes out very naturally. So
Right.
that could potentially be something that repeats itself. But
Yes.
the experience of writing a piece is almost never the same as any other. So most of the pieces I write are a little bit smaller scale than what you've been writing, and so a lot of times it's more like a head, or like sort of more elaborate head or launch pad for
Right.
improvisation. But um, from the moment that you start the idea, I find like by the time I'm writing the second or third note, it's already different than the original idea in my head. And where it goes from there is more dictated by the sequence of events of writing it than it is by the initial impulse. And so that is so dependent on mood and what I've been thinking about, or what I've been listening to, or what I've am focused on in any way, and what the goal of the piece is, like, am I trying to write something exciting, or am I trying to write something somber? Like it all filters in there. But in every single case that I can think of, it always became something that is in some way surprising to me. You know.
That's beautiful. That's for me, that's it. It's that the gift of surprise,
Mm.
and the concept I got from McCoy Tyner and the great pianist with John Coltrane's great quartet of the 1960s from what 60 to 64. He played with Trey until 1965
Mm.
because he recorded with them during part of that year. Um, but he said new songs would come and they would be like children,
Mm.
and that the children would teach you who they are. As you would tour, you would sort of explore it more, and you'd learn how to expand on what happened before, and you're always pushing yourself to do something new.
Right.
Okay. So a lot of times here we go back to that word, I experiment a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one piece in 1978 I wrote, um, and I would have manuscript by my bed. And as soon as I would wake up, I would turn and I would start composing. And I would compose until I became really conscious. Then I stopped. And I would take the piece on the road. And so you're really disorientated when you're flying through all these time zones. Um, and you just get up and you write until you feel like you're there. You don't want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned something so profound about that process. you know that piece was called Crystal Text. Initially it was a duo piece for Anthony Davis and myself, and then I wrote it for small improvising ensemble. And but so every time, sometimes I'm thinking about, I'll have a notebook of all of these different sketches, and sometimes I'll write out rhythmical patterns that will be sort of set up, or I might take a particular clave and twist it a little bit that might have come from West Africa or Afro-Cuban music, or in the case of Psalm 119, I'm doing a lot of deep theological research, but I want to be led. And see, you've described to me some of the ways that you were led as you're writing. And I think what happens is that that space that you go to when you're creating, it gets larger and larger as your experiences grow. I'm going to guarantee you something. You're going to be writing big pieces.
Mm.
You won't have an option because that space that you're in is a very profoundly precious space. We look at that space, different parts of the world, we look at that space differently.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but one of the things that we cannot argue with is the fact that we can look at how people go into that space in other parts of the world, and we're incredibly moved by what the fruit produced from the tree in that particular soil.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody's given something that is theirs uniquely to develop. And some people run away from it. And some people learn to embrace it. And it's also a space sometimes of great pain.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also, sometimes you're confronted with your shortcomings.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to look at them head on and not let them debilitate you, but learn from them.
Yeah.
Man, we've all made a lot of mistakes, you know. And, but I think as we get in that space, we have the potential to really evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's about looking at the human condition, and some people look at the human condition in a secular space, and some people look at the human condition from a sacred space, and both have their roles
Mm-hmm.
in our development. And you know, that's something I feel strongly about.
Yeah. Thinking about what you're saying as far as, confronting pain, um, one of the things I try to think about in terms of whether you're playing music or improvising or composing, um, one of the things that we try to strive for is a sense of shared humanity, a sense of shared consciousness, even, and so in a way, even the expression of pain or the grappling with pain in a musical context can be a part of a pursuit of joy, because you're seeking that shared consciousness and that shared sense of humanity.
Yes, yes.
And before we started recording, one of the things we were sort of talking about is how sort of exhausting this time period of COVID-19 and then now protests and the coming election cycle and all this kind of stuff, how exhausting and draining it can feel. And one of the things that I think we can do both on a personal level and a cultural level as artists is to find out how we want to interface with this really potent time. And um, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what an artist's responsibility is in times like this, what your sort of perception of this time period is like, and I don't know, anything else you might want to add on to that idea.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I'm I go back to my childhood. I go back to see the news and Dr. King marching and women and men putting their lives in great danger because they believe in ideals that they believe that women and men have the right to. A respect for every person, for the law to be fair, for people to love who they want to love, for people to have equal opportunity. And it hasn't been the case, you know. And now with Breonna Taylor, George Conley, and so many others, the flagrant evil of the time makes me want to come back with what I believe in the most. You know, in my case, it's this, you know, from beginning to end. That's what I live by, you know. My life is dedicated to Christ. And I think about Dr. King marching, as I said, and I think about brave people who marched with him. And we got to get to the point where we just say, this has got to stop. This can't go on any longer. And again, in the very beginning was what you and I had talked about. We have to be able to get in someone else's skin. We've got to feel what they're feeling. And no matter who it's happening to, got to fight. Focus on Black Lives Matter. So we're dropping like flies by the police department. Brown sisters and brothers are dropping like flies because of the police department. Discrimination against Asians is going up like crazy because the President of the United States, is perpetrating all of these things, and it's not bringing the people together. He's doing the exact opposite. And it's like, it affects you on so many different levels. So for me, I have to say, I'm thinking in the sacred realm, you know, because that is my space. That's what I've been given to do. That's my assignment. And it's like people have different assignments, you know? And right now, there's no other choice for me. I've got to go there. This is what I have to do. You know, my oldest friend is in the hospital fighting for his life right now. And there's reasons why his body is in the shape it's in. Some of it has to do with the fact that the hits you take from systemic racism day in and day out, it's brutal. It's violent. It's evil. It's the levelty of cruelty is like that police officer who sat there with his hands in his pocket, you know, as if this is something almost casual. Or the bird watcher in Central Park, you know, I'm going to tell him this African-American man is asking me to, you know, put a leash on my freaking dog. And that's not derogatory towards dogs. It's just how she weaponized her white privilege. You know, we have to look at all of this and see as people of color, we go to other countries, there's way more opportunity, you know? So I've understood what this is since I was a kid, because my parents, they taught me. There's things I had to teach my kids that puts tears in my eyes, and how they deal with the police. You know, as soon as before they started driving, they knew when they started to drive that if they were ever stopped by the police, there's a vocabulary that we had to teach those kids. And the first thing they have to learn is to freaking put their hands on the steering wheel. Okay? And the frustration of going in and out of these institutions or corporate America, in my dear friend's case, the racism that he had to carry around every day. It's like putting on a 50, 75 pound coat, and you're carrying that weight around every day. Why do I know it's the case? Well, look at me, number one. Number two, I've been privileged to travel around the world. So I've been out of this environment, and I know what other environments feel like. I know what it feels like to be in West Africa. I know what it feels like to be in South Africa. I know what it feels like to be in certain countries where you go there to get a vacation from freaking racism. Okay? And I'm not a bitter person. I'm a person of faith, which means that I always carry hope. That's what my mother taught me, you know. I'm concerned about my grandchildren. I'm concerned about my children. And as a person who was taught to respect everyone around the world, all of the people of color that have to traverse this madness, we've got so far to go. But I do have to say this. We knew when President Obama got elected that the backlash would be really violent. We knew it was coming. We knew. And I'm very proud of the youth for stepping up, of all hues, coming together, showing an example for the world that the people are different than what's happening in the government right now. There is a huge disconnection, but we're fighting systemic racism, we're fighting sexism. And if you think it does not impact the music world, think again. And I think one of the cruelest things that have been done is a lot of times there's a stamp of entertainment that needs to be put on artists of color. And that there's less opportunity for them to operate in a circle as transformative artists that are making a statement. I know for some Black composers, one of the things that some of these symphony orchestras and other things that want, when they do want perform a Black composer's work, they want them to write something that they can read through very quickly, so they can schedule most of the rehearsal time for somebody that looks different from them, who might be writing demanding music. Well, why shouldn't we have the ability to write demanding music? You know, why should women? They need the same ability, you know. And we can go on and on really deep, but it's almost like Shostakovich on a certain level. you know? Just think of, with all of the stuff that got left behind, think if he would have been free, what he might have written,
Mm.
you know? But he was put in a system, and he had to figure out ways to do something within the system that could tell the world what his soul was feeling.
Mm.
We just want the freedom and the respect for the works to be done, and for us to not have to get on the plane all of the time to get our works done. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's I pay taxes. You know, I pay a lot of them, and when I say I'm talking about my wife and I, both of us. As one unit is. The two shall become one. But I mean, we're contributing to this country. I'll just say that. I don't know. So all of those things, those are some of the things that I feel.
Yeah.
But when I look at my kids are Black, and they're Vietnamese American. And my granddaughter looks like a Latina, and my grandson looks more Asian. What's going to happen to them? Are they still going to have to be going through this crap when they get a little older? It's like, man.
Yeah, and one thing I think we as white people who want to be friends and allies need to be careful of is how we go about doing that. I know just as an anecdote, there's an organization. I'm going to speak in anonymous terms because,
Mm-hmm.
but there's an organization I know that presents new music that wanted to show some solidarity, and so they went about putting together a video performance of a modern work that they called an African American friend of mine to perform in the video. And I'm trying to think about how to do this without revealing, but the intention was very good, to show some solidarity. But what they chose to program was a piece by a white European composer, and they wanted the performer to figure out a way to adjust the tempos in the piece to essentially cut it by about 5 minutes so that it could fit into 8 minutes and 46 seconds without having talked to the composer about it. And so that they could quickly do this video to show some solidarity. And my initial impression when I was talking to my friend about this, I mean, we were talking about it because we're very close, and he was wondering whether he should do it. And ultimately, it was really clear he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to be the sort of tokenized face of this organization's sort of
Yeah.
attempt at some kind of messaging, especially when it would have been a perfect opportunity to commission a Black American composer to write something, or to perform some already composed work, to elevate, a voice that was more directly related to the current moment, rather than looking in the sort of Eurocentric contemporary music canon for a white European composer who had dealt with similar topics. And it was sort of like, to me it was like a real shame, because it's a missed opportunity.
Yes.
And it's not ill-intentioned, but it actually doesn't help. And I think that's one of the things that we, as friends and allies, need to be really careful about, is like how we want to go about, displaying support and doing things that actually help, because otherwise it's all lip service.
You mentioned some very crucial words. dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Do, for these organizations, I would say do some research. Do exactly what you did, is you spoke with the person that they approached. Maybe they need to receive some education about how
Mm-hmm.
uh, to speak, so they're just, it's just a band-aid perpetration of systemic racism. Let's just call it for what it is,
Yeah.
you know? Uh, and it doesn't move the needle at all. What moves the needle is to make sure, I won't mention the person's name or the organization that they work with, but there is another organization in LA that record is far better than most, and they're re-examining everything that they're doing right now from the ground up,
Mm-hmm.
rather than you know, taking something disrespectful because you haven't done your research. They're trying to say, look, um, I said something really crazy one time at Disney Hall. I said, I look forward to the day when half of the composers that are performed in this hall are women.
Yeah.
Seems natural to me, you know. Uh, and See, people of color, it's been so exclusionary, that world, because it's so much about white supremacy. It's about the perpetuation of white supremacy. And it's a fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
In my eyes, God touches whom he chooses to touch, you know? Um, and I've been astonished over and over and over all around the world in my travels by what I felt, by what I heard, and the amazing diversity that existed in the people that had something profound to give the world. I try to always share with students ability to come humble.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say that enough. I think if this organization, if that's one of the things that they thought about, if they came humble, then they would do some research. They would shut up and they would listen,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And they would have to look at their own faults, like we were talking about early as composers. When we go into that special space, that space that you walk in and you come out with something that you share with the world,
Mm-hmm.
that is precious, is dear to life for you, you know? It's like uh, it's your time to contribute to the world something that is going to help the listener. It's going to make it might be something provocative, and another piece it might be something that's deeply emotional, that's tied to the essence of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's precious, you know. And people that look differently than you and I all need to have access to share what it is that we deem to be precious. For some of us, it's secular. For some of it, it is sacred, it's holy. What I feel, I didn't go up the mountain and speak with God like Moses did. I went up the hill and communed with God. Little lowly me. And I came down and I was transformed. And I take this transformation and I humbly put it in a Sibelius score. And it's an offering to God. That's what I do.
Mm.
That's it.
Well, that's profound to say the least. But humble acts like that, like you say, coming humble, that can be profound.
Yes. And they don't know it all.
Mm-hmm.
These organizations, they don't know it all.
Sure.
There's so much they have to learn. And they're going to, their audiences, um, the audiences will be expanded.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there is an orchestra that well-known orchestra that I've had a few experiences with. Um, one experience I did with them, with a smaller ensemble within the orchestra, and they said after the performance, "Oh, that was really nice. We're going to set up a meeting to commission a work for you." The meeting never happened.
Mm.
They contacted me again about 4 or 5 years later, and they said, we want to have this meeting." Meeting never happened. Why even call? It's
Right.
just, you know, it's,
Yeah.
it's just, it's how it is.
Well, again, I don't want to keep you too long, but I've got one other thing I'd love to ask you. Speaking of organizations that don't know it all, I would say that 95% of my musical education has occurred outside of an institution. And I know that, like some of our patrons here on Patreon are either nearing the end of their experience at a college, or recently graduated, just getting out into the musical world. And at the moment, we're in this lockdown, or mostly lockdown situation, where concerts certainly aren't happening, and it's very difficult for musicians to work with each other in isolation. Uh, what would you say to young people in this kind of a situation, who are starting out on their trajectory as um, musicians, either professional or in their own personal quest? Uh, what words of encouragement or advice could you offer people at that stage in their development?
I'll give them what my father gave me. He said, "You have to work twice as hard as everybody else." Uh, and he said that part of that had to do with my hue, but part of that had to do with um, really taking the time to strive for greatness. Don't let the long tones heal you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd spend more time, if I were a singer, I would practice one note at different dynamics, without vibrato, with a little bit of vibrato, changing the color, using different vowels to get so far inside of it. And the other thing I would do is I would spend a period of time practicing new sounds. Make sure that you keep that. I think what this isolation has done in part, it's given us more time, because we're not commuting. For most people, particularly in urban centers, we spend hours and hours commuting. And so now we have that time to produce more, and to be quiet, and to be still. But I would say be methodical about working on your craft. And also be methodical about improvising, consistently doing new things. I would also say to practice the things that are the most difficult for you. Put those in front. One example, Mingus, he practiced his pinky so he could get more dexterity, more fluidity with his pinky. And so when I read that, I said, okay, I'm going to take the third octave of the flute and I'm going to practice that more than any other octave because you have more finger changes and people aren't as fluent on the third octave than they are on the lower two octaves of the flute. So I think that served me really well because I felt completely free up there when I was performing all the time. Almost completely free, I should say. The other thing is disconnect from the technology sometimes, to where you're in a space, or maybe it's just you or someone you're living with, your partner who you're married to, or maybe a close friend. You guys are practicing social distancing. But I think we have to work harder to keep those connections. We can't do without them, you know. So we have to figure out new ways to make that work to where we feel enriched after, you know, we have that kind of communication with one another. And I would also, just on a business, in a practical sense, thinking about ways you can connect with other artists in different parts of the world. And then you can maybe work on collaborating with them in the future where they would come here and you would go to their country. I think that's huge. And a lot of young artists that have really spent time doing that. If nothing else, you put on your resume that you played in these other countries. That's going to serve you very well. And then eventually, maybe you start making recordings with some of those artists. Think out of the box and don't, you know, we were talking about all these obstacles that I shared with you that I've had to face, but they weren't going to stop me. You know, I knew that there were other ways to make it work. And I wouldn't be satisfied being defeated or oppressed. You're not going to have the victory. The victory is yours. It takes some imagination. And in my sense, I got on my knees sometimes and said, help me, Jesus, because I needed help, you know? And people go to who they need to go to, or they figure out their way. You know, I've talked about my way. I've talked about respecting other people's choices. And I think the last thing that I can tell, and it sounds like the 60s, but a product of the 60s, is to spread love, spread compassion. And I pray for all of the listeners that they have people in their lives that can take the time to really listen to them and take the time to listen to others around you to feel what they're going through. And you will grow and you will help them and they will help you.
Beautiful, man. Really beautiful.
Okay. You're my brother. And the other thing I wanted to say is I thank you for all that you're doing and who you are. And I believe in you. I stand by your side as your friend and your brother, you know. And Narinda Records is a wonderful thing that you're doing for all of us. So this is something I just really want to give a shout out to you now, and just say keep on keeping on. And the other thing about you, you always come humble. You always come humble, and you know, when I see that, it just makes me love you even more.
Oh man, well, thank you. I mean, the feeling is incredibly mutual, and I couldn't be more honored to be able to share your words with all the patrons on this page. And as always, this interview will be publicly available. So if any of you out there want to share it, with people that you think might be inspired, please do so. I really want this to be a resource for people to find new perspectives and inspiration. And James, thank you so much.
All right, Dan.
Yeah.
And take good care. And send a copy to me. Okay.
I will, absolutely.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Right. Thank you.
And all the
James.
best to your wife, man.
You too.
All right. Take care now.